What's the most convincing conspiracy theory you've heard? Story 1. The LHC broke reality, and that's why nothing feels right anymore. Okay, so this theory has a real physics hook buried in it, which is exactly why it's so sticky. The Large Hadron Collider switched on in September 2008, and the theory holds that the act of smashing particles together at energies never before achieved by humans somehow knocked our timeline sideways into a slightly different, slightly worse version of reality. Close enough to the original that most things look the same, different enough that specific details feel subtly, persistently wrong. This is the explanation a lot of Mandela effect believers reach for. The shared, confident, detailed false memories millions of people have about things like the spelling of the Berenstain Bears or the existence of a Sinbad genie movie. If you're certain you remember something a specific way and the documented record disagrees, the timeline changed is a more comforting explanation than human memory is reconstructive infallible because it doesn't require you to distrust your own mind. The LHC framing adds a sense of mechanism that pure Mandela effect speculation lacks on its own. Instead of vague hand-waving about parallel universes, you get a specific date, a specific machine, and a specific moment that supposedly hinges the whole thing. Physicists will tell you the LHC's actual function, probing the Higgs field and fundamental particle interactions, has nothing in its established physics that could plausibly produce a timeline shift, and the dates people cite for the world getting weird don't cleanly line up with the LHC's actual activation history anyway. What's genuinely interesting isn't whether it's true. It's that this theory gives a population experiencing a kind of collective, ambient unease about how strange the 2010s and 2020s have felt a specific villain and a specific origin event, instead of an amorphous, harder-to-name cultural and informational shift. People want a cause. The LHC is a satisfyingly concrete one. Story 2. Real trees were enormous, ancient, and Devil's Tower is one of their stumps. This is one of those theories that starts from a real, jaw-dropping fact and then sprints past it into something the geology can't support. The real fact: Earth used to have genuinely enormous trees and plants, particularly during the Carboniferous period roughly 300 to 360 million years ago, when giant lycopsids, tree-like plants distantly related to modern club mosses, grew to heights of 30 to 50 meters, towering over a landscape that looked nothing like the forests we have today. This isn't speculation, we have fossils. The theory extends this into something much stranger, that these weren't just unusually large ancient plants, but a completely different category of real trees, dwarfing anything alive now by orders of magnitude, and that some of these ancient giants have survived into the present day as fossilized stumps that we've simply misidentified as geological formations. Devil's Tower in Wyoming, the dramatic steep-sided igneous rock formation made famous by close encounters of the third kind, gets cited specifically as one of these petrified stumps. The geology here is not ambiguous. Devil's Tower is a well-studied igneous intrusion, formed from magma that pushed up into existing sedimentary rock, roughly 50 million years ago, and then cooled into the columnar phonolite porphyry structure visible today, with the surrounding softer sedimentary rock eroding away over millions of years to expose it. Its composition, mineral structure, and formation history have been documented extensively, and bear no resemblance to fossilized wood, which preserves recognizable cellular plant structure under microscopic and chemical analysis. What keeps this alive isn't evidence. It's the emotional logic of the claim that something genuinely enormous and ancient has been hiding in plain sight, misidentified by the entire scientific establishment, just waiting for someone to finally look at it correctly. Story 3. Willie McRae, the death-ruled suicide that a lot of people still don't believe. This one is genuinely unsettling because it's not speculative folklore, it's a real documented death with real documented gaps in the official explanation. Willie McRae was a Scottish solicitor and prominent campaigner for Scottish independence and against nuclear power, found in April 1985 in his crashed car on a remote Highland road. He died from what was ultimately ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The details that have kept this case alive for nearly 40 years are specific and genuinely strange. The gun used to kill him was never recovered at the scene despite extensive searching. It was found some distance away in a river days later, in a location that raised questions about whether McRae in his final moments could plausibly have thrown it there himself. There were also reports, contested but persistent, of a second shot, and witness accounts describing other vehicles near the crash site around the time it occurred, accounts that were not thoroughly pursued by the original investigation. What elevates this beyond a contested but ordinary death investigation is McRae's documented activism and the equally documented fact that British state security services, including Special Branch and MI5, maintained surveillance files on political activists during this period, with McRae's anti-nuclear and pro-independence campaigning placing him plausibly within the scope of that surveillance. Subsequent Freedom of Information efforts and journalistic investigation have confirmed McRae was indeed monitored, even though no document has ever surfaced directly linking that surveillance to his death. The official ruling of suicide has never been formally overturned, and no new criminal investigation has reopened the case despite sustained pressure from campaigners and McRae's family over decades. What you're left with is a genuinely incomplete official account, a documented surveillance relationship, and a death that, depending on who's telling the story, looks either like a tragic, lonely end or something considerably darker. Story 4 billionaires funded the Twitter purchase specifically to tank it. The theory here has a specific, almost elegant structure, that Elon Musk's 2022 acquisition of Twitter wasn't simply an impulsive, ego-driven purchase by one extremely wealthy individual, but a coordinated effort by multiple billionaires who understood that Twitter, in its pre-acquisition form, functioned as critical infrastructure for organizing protest movements, labor actions, and political coordination, and that degrading the platform's usability and reliability served their collective interests in suppressing that coordination capacity. The actual documented financing of the deal does show multiple wealthy co-investors beyond Musk himself. The roughly $44 billion acquisition included equity financing from a range of sources including Saudi Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, venture capital firms, and other billionaires, structured to reduce the amount of debt financing and personal capital Musk needed to commit directly. This part is genuinely documented in SEC filings, not speculative. Where the theory moves from documented fact into speculation is the claimed shared intent to deliberately degrade the platform, the observable post-acquisition changes, substantial reductions in content moderation staff, changes to verification systems, shifts in algorithmic content promotion, and a documented decline in advertiser confidence and platform usability for many users are consistent with both deliberate degradation by design and the considerably more mundane explanation of a new owner making a series of rapid, poorly tested changes to a complex system while simultaneously dealing with enormous debt service obligations from a leveraged buyout. The theory's appeal comes from a reasonable, widely shared anxiety about platform power and coordination capacity in the social media age. Whether the platform's documented decline reflects coordinated sabotage or simply chaotic, ideologically driven management under financial pressure is the genuine open question the theory tries to resolve a little too neatly. Story 5. Nixon was spying on his political opponents, and we have the receipts. This entry is presented with tongue firmly in cheek, and it's worth appreciating the joke for what it actually is. Watergate isn't a conspiracy theory at all. It's one of the most exhaustively documented political scandals in American history, with a paper trail, a Senate investigation, taped recordings, criminal convictions, and a presidential resignation, all stemming from exactly the claim being presented here, as if it needed defending. In June 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., attempting to wiretap phones and photograph documents. The subsequent investigation, driven by journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, a Senate Watergate committee, and eventually special prosecutors, established a direct chain connecting the break-in to the committee to re-elect the president, and ultimately to the Oval Office itself, including White House-ordered payments to the burglars to buy their silence and Nixon's own taped conversations discussing the cover-up. The Nixon tapes, secret Oval Office recordings Nixon himself had installed, ironically, which became the decisive evidence against him once subpoenaed, included the so-called smoking gun tape from June 1972, in which Nixon explicitly discusses using the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation. Nixon resigned in August 1974 rather than face near-certain impeachment and removal, the only U.S. president to ever resign from office. The hear me out, I know it's crazy framing is the entire joke. This isn't a fringe theory requiring careful charitable interpretation. It's settled history with more supporting documentation than almost any other claim on this entire list. Sometimes the most convincing conspiracy theory is the one that turned out to be exhaustively, undeniably, boringly true. Story 6. Every mythical creature existed at some point, somewhere. The logic underlying this theory has genuine intuitive pull. Vampires, werewolves, unicorns, mermaids, dragons, ghosts, wendigos, Bigfoot, nearly every culture across the world, often with no documented contact with each other, has developed strikingly similar categories of supernatural or monstrous beings. Shape-shifting predators that hunt humans. Beautiful, dangerous beings that lure travelers near water. Massive serpentine creatures with treasure-hoarding tendencies. If these stories arose completely independently across cultures with no shared point of contact, doesn't that consistency suggest some shared underlying reality rather than pure coincidental invention? The more grounded explanation researchers in comparative mythology and folklore studies actually favor involves universal features of human psychology and the natural world that would predictably produce similar monster categories without requiring any of them to be literally real. Humans across all cultures share the same basic predator avoidance instincts, the same fear responses to darkness and the unknown, and the same tendency to anthropomorphize unexplained natural phenomena. Large undiscovered animals genuinely have existed and been discovered after long periods as mythical. The giant squid, the okapi, the coelacanth, which gives some intuitive support to maybe more creatures like this are still out there, even though none of those real discoveries actually validated the most fantastical elements like dragon fire breathing or vampire immortality. Fossil discoveries by pre-scientific cultures also plausibly explain some specific myths directly. Large fossilized bones encountered without any framework for understanding deep geological time and extinct species would naturally be interpreted as evidence of dragons, giants, or other monstrous beings, which is a documented phenomenon in the history of paleontology and folklore studies alike. The theory survives not because the evidence demands it, but because the alternative, that human imagination across unconnected cultures converged on remarkably similar monsters purely through shared psychology, is somehow less satisfying than believing at least some of it was real. Story 7. Hollow Earth Kaiju and the Secret International Cover-Up, disguised as movie studios. This is delivered with enough theatrical enthusiasm that it's clearly, gloriously self-aware, and it deserves credit for combining two completely separate conspiracy traditions into something genuinely new. The classic Hollow Earth theory, proposing a habitable interior to our planet accessible through polar openings, gets fused here with giant monster mythology, populated specifically with kaiju, the Japanese term for the giant monsters of Godzilla and similar franchises, and giant apes, very obviously gesturing at King Kong. The escalation is the best part. The theory proposes that this hidden ecosystem of giant creatures is real and that Japan's entire kaiju film industry, Godzilla, Mothra, the whole genre stretching back to 1954, exists not as creative entertainment but as a deliberate, decades-long disinformation campaign, normalizing the concept of giant monsters in the public imagination specifically so that if evidence of the real Hollow Earth creatures ever leaked, the public would dismiss it as more of the same fictional monster movie content they'd already been consuming for generations. The eventual creative partnership between Japanese studios and Legendary Pictures, the American company behind the modern MonsterVerse films including Godzilla vs. Kong, gets folded into this as evidence of an expanding international deep state cover-up operation. The actual science of Hollow Earth theory has been comprehensively closed for over a century through seismology. Earthquake-generated seismic waves travel through and reflect off the Earth's interior in ways that have mapped a solid inner core, a liquid outer core, and a solid mantle in extraordinary detail, leaving no plausible room for a habitable hollow interior of any kind, let alone one large enough to support giant monster populations. What makes this version genuinely fun rather than menacing is that it reads less like sincere belief and more like someone building an elaborate, entertaining cinematic universe of their own, using the conspiracy theory format as the creative container. Story 8. Aliens threatened humanity into forming the UN after Hiroshima. This theory builds its premise on a genuinely terrifying real historical moment, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and proposes that the destructive power humanity demonstrated to itself didn't go unnoticed by an external, technologically superior intelligence watching from elsewhere, who delivered an implicit or explicit ultimatum: stop engaging in warfare of this magnitude, or face collective punishment or elimination as a species. The United Nations, in this telling, wasn't formed primarily out of the documented historical motivations, the catastrophic failure of the League of Nations to prevent World War II, the genuine desire among Allied leaders to build an international framework for collective security and diplomatic resolution, but as a placating gesture toward an off-world authority, a performance of restraint, specifically designed to satisfy observers who were prepared to act if humanity didn't demonstrate it could control itself. The theory's appeal lies in the genuine puzzle it's trying to solve. Why, in a world stocked with thousands of nuclear weapons and led at various points by leaders with well-documented ego, paranoia, and brinkmanship tendencies, has a full-scale nuclear exchange never actually occurred since 1945? The conventional historical and game theory answer involves mutually assured destruction, diplomatic frameworks, arms control treaties, and a series of close calls that were narrowly avoided through luck and individual decision-making under pressure, rather than through any external threat. That answer, while well-documented, doesn't fully satisfy the intuition that something must be holding back a species that has otherwise demonstrated, repeatedly, a willingness to engage in horrific violence. The alien-enforced peace theory offers a tidier, more dramatic explanation for genuine restraint that's actually attributable to a complicated, fragile combination of deterrence theory, diplomatic institution building, and a fair amount of uncomfortable luck. Story 9. The Dead Internet Theory. Less and less of what you're reading was written by a person. This theory has aged from fringe speculation into something a meaningfully larger portion of internet users now consider at least partially plausible, and the underlying claim has gotten harder to dismiss as AI-generated content has become genuinely difficult to distinguish from human writing in casual browsing contexts. The original, more extreme version of the Dead Internet Theory, which circulated in online forums starting around 2021, claimed that the majority of internet content and even social media engagement is and has been artificially generated for years, with bots talking to other bots, manufacturing engagement and trending topics, in a coordinated effort variously attributed to government agencies, including specifically the CIA, working to manage and shape public discourse and opinion at scale. The CIA coordination-specific element remains entirely speculative and unsupported by any documented evidence. But the broader, less conspiratorial version of the underlying concern has become considerably more grounded in recent years as large language models have made AI-generated text, images, and even video dramatically more prevalent and harder to detect than the bot content of the early 2020s. Studies analyzing bot activity on platforms like Twitter X, both before and after Musk's acquisition, have found substantial percentages of accounts and engagement that genuinely originate from automated rather than human sources. And academic researchers have documented measurable, accelerating growth in AI-generated content across the web more broadly, sometimes referred to in research literature as model collapse risk, where AI systems increasingly train on AI-generated content rather than human-generated content, in a kind of feedback loop. You don't need a coordinated government psyop to explain a genuinely declining ratio of human to synthetic content online. You just need the economic incentives of content farming combined with increasingly capable generative AI tools, which is a considerably less exciting, but more verifiably real explanation for the same underlying unease. Story 10. Ancient aliens engineered us specifically to mine gold for them. This theory draws heavily on Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation of Sumerian mythology, proposing that the Anunnaki, described in Sumerian texts as beings who descended from the heavens, genetically engineered early humans specifically as a labor force, with their primary directive being the extraction of gold, which the Anunnaki supposedly needed for purposes ranging from atmospheric repair on their homeworld to advanced technological applications we wouldn't understand. The theory's supporting evidence usually points to humanity's deep, cross-cultural fascination with gold specifically, not just as currency but as something treated with near-universal reverence across civilizations with no contact with each other. Used in religious objects, royal regalia, and burial practices across Egyptian, South American, Asian, and European cultures alike, often well before gold had any established trade or currency value in those specific societies. If gold is just a shiny metal, the reasoning goes, why does virtually every human culture independently arrive at treating it as uniquely sacred or valuable unless something deeper, possibly even genetically encoded, is driving that universal response? The more grounded explanation, supported by behavioral and evolutionary psychology, points to gold's actual physical properties: its rarity, its visual brightness and reflectivity, its resistance to corrosion and tarnishing, unlike most other naturally occurring metals, which makes it uniquely suited to symbolizing permanence and value across long time periods, and its malleability for crafting. Humans are also documented to have a general cognitive bias toward valuing scarce, visually striking objects broadly, not specifically gold, which is a more parsimonious explanation for cross-cultural gold reverence than a genetically implanted alien mining directive. Sitchin's specific Sumerian translations underlying the Anunnaki gold mining narrative have been disputed extensively by professional Assyriologists and Sumerian scholars who argue his translations take considerable liberties with the original cuneiform texts. The fascination with gold is real and universal. The proposed cause remains entirely speculative. Story 11. Soviet scientists really did try to breed humans with chimpanzees. This is one of the rare entries on a list like this where the wild-sounding claim turns out to be substantially, documentarily true, which makes it genuinely one of the most unsettling entries here precisely because it requires almost no embellishment. Ilya Ivanov was a real Soviet biologist, a pioneer in the field of artificial insemination who had already achieved significant success crossbreeding various other animal species. In the 1920s, with backing and approval from Soviet authorities who were interested in the ideological and scientific implications of demonstrating closer biological continuity between humans and other primates, Ivanov pursued a series of documented experiments attempting to create a human-chimpanzee hybrid, an organism sometimes referred to in historical accounts using the term human Z. Ivanov traveled to French Guiana in 1926 specifically to conduct these experiments, attempting to artificially inseminate female chimpanzees with human sperm without the female's knowledge or consent in any meaningful sense, none of which produced a successful pregnancy. He subsequently attempted, with Soviet government support, to find human women willing to be inseminated with chimpanzee sperm as a parallel approach. Historical records suggest a clinic in Sukhumi, in what is now Georgia, was prepared for such procedures, though documentation about whether any human subjects actually underwent the procedure remains incomplete and disputed by historians. Ivanov fell out of favor during subsequent Stalinist political purges and was arrested and exiled in 1930, with his research program terminated before any successful hybrid was reportedly produced, though the incompleteness of Soviet-era records leaves some genuine historical ambiguity about exactly how far the human-side experiments progressed. The science underlying why this could never have actually succeeded is now well understood. Humans and chimpanzees, despite sharing roughly 98% genetic similarity, have different chromosome counts and structures that make viable hybrid offspring essentially biologically impossible. But the documented historical attempt, sanctioned by a state government, remains genuinely real. Story 12. The Hollow Moon. Why a 1970s NASA seismic reading still won't go away. The hollow moon theory has one specific piece of real, documented evidence at its center, which is exactly why it has outlasted most comparably fringe theories. When the Apollo 12 astronauts deliberately crashed their lunar module ascent stage onto the moon's surface in November 1969 as a seismic test, the seismometers they'd left behind recorded something genuinely unexpected. The moon rang like a bell, with detectable vibrations continuing for approximately 55 minutes after impact. Subsequent deliberate impacts in later Apollo missions produced similarly extended ringing, with one continuing for over 3 hours. NASA's own scientists at the time described the result as surprising, and that specific word choice, surprising, from the space agency's own personnel, is what theories like this one tend to fixate on and amplify. If the moon is solid rock all the way through, the reasoning goes, wouldn't an impact produce a duller, faster dampened response, more like striking solid stone, rather than the extended resonance you'd expect from something hollow or structurally unusual? The scientific explanation, developed through subsequent decades of lunar seismology research, points to the moon's unusually dry composition compared to Earth. The near-total absence of water throughout the lunar interior means there's far less material available to dampen and absorb seismic vibrations the way water-saturated rock does on Earth, allowing vibrations to propagate and persist for much longer than equivalent impacts would on our planet. This explains the extended ringing without requiring any hollow internal structure, and it's consistent with everything else known about lunar geology from seismometer networks, gravitational mapping, and returned lunar samples, none of which show any evidence of internal hollow cavities. The Y-Files and similarly styled content creators have kept this theory in circulation precisely because the underlying NASA data and the agency's own contemporary description of it as surprising make for a genuinely compelling hook, even though the dry rock explanation has been well established in the lunar science literature for decades. Story 13. We're all living in a simulation and this world isn't actually real. Simulation theory has moved from fringe philosophical thought experiment to something a genuinely surprising number of credentialed scientists and technologists take seriously, which separates it from most entries on this list. Elon Musk has publicly endorsed a version of it, and Nick Bostrom's formal 2003 simulation argument remains a serious, frequently cited paper in academic philosophy rather than internet speculation alone. Bostrom's actual argument is a trilemma rather than a direct claim. Either civilizations capable of running detailed ancestor simulations almost always go extinct before reaching that technological capability, or such civilizations almost universally choose not to run such simulations even when capable, or we are almost certainly living in a simulation right now, since simulated minds would vastly outnumber biological original minds if even one civilization ran many such simulations. The logic, taken on its own terms, is genuinely difficult to refute cleanly, which is part of why it's attracted serious academic engagement rather than dismissal. The supporting circumstantial evidence people point to includes the deeply strange behavior of quantum mechanics at small scales. Particles behaving probabilistically rather than deterministically until measured, the observer effect appearing to give measurement itself a special causal role, which some have suggested resembles a rendering engine only calculating detail when something is actively looking, conserving computational resources the way a video game doesn't render an area until a player's camera turns toward it. The discrete quantized nature of physical reality at the Planck scale has similarly been compared to pixels or a minimum resolution limit. None of this constitutes evidence in the rigorous scientific sense. Quantum mechanics has its own well-developed, non-simulation explanatory frameworks that most physicists find sufficient on their own terms. But the philosophical argument itself remains genuinely unresolved and taken seriously by serious people, which gives this theory a credibility most others on this list simply don't have. Story 14. We are beings of energy asleep inside a simulation we built ourselves. This is a more mystical, consciousness-centered cousin of standard simulation theory, and it's worth treating it as its own distinct flavor rather than a simple restatement, because the emphasis here is less on computational simulation in the Bostrom sense and more on a spiritual or metaphysical claim about the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, that we are not biological brains generating awareness, but vibrational energy or consciousness temporarily experiencing a constructed reality, with the implication that if we fully understood this, we would have far greater control over the physical world than we currently exercise or even believe possible. The appeal of this framing draws on a real and genuinely unresolved problem in philosophy of mind called the hard problem of consciousness. The question of why and how physical processes in the brain produce subjective experience at all, rather than the brain simply processing information without any accompanying inner awareness. No materialist scientific framework has yet produced a fully satisfying mechanistic explanation for subjective experience, which leaves a genuine gap that consciousness-based theories like this one are filling with metaphysical rather than scientific answers. Quantum mechanics gets invoked here too, often pointing to the way observation appears to affect quantum systems, which gets stretched into the claim that consciousness itself is fundamentally generative of physical reality rather than merely observing or measuring a reality that exists independently. Serious physicists almost universally reject this extrapolation. The observer effect in quantum mechanics refers to the physical interaction required to measure a quantum system, not to conscious awareness specifically, and various interpretations of quantum mechanics that don't require any special role for consciousness explain the same experimental results without it. What this theory ultimately offers isn't physics, it's a spiritually framed answer to mortality, meaning, and powerlessness, using scientific-sounding vocabulary as its delivery mechanism rather than its actual evidentiary foundation. Story 15. The government secretly recruits psychically gifted children into a hidden facility. This theory proposes that certain people are born with genuine paranormal abilities, telepathy, levitation, astral projection, communication with spirits, and that a covert government program identifies these individuals during childhood and removes them from their families to be trained and eventually deployed for classified purposes, with the program's existence kept entirely hidden from the public. The theory draws real documented historical fuel from Project Stargate, the actual CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency program that ran from the early 1970s through 1995, investigating remote viewing and other psychic phenomena for potential intelligence applications. Funded with roughly $20 million across its run, this program genuinely existed, was conducted with reasonably rigorous experimental protocols by credentialed physicists at Stanford Research Institute, and was reviewed by the American Institutes for Research at the CIA's request in 1995. Which concluded that statistical results exceeded random chance in some experiments, but that the program had not produced operationally useful intelligence, leading to its official termination. The theory in question extends this documented program considerably further, into the much more dramatic and entirely unsubstantiated claim of childhood identification and forcible recruitment, an escalation with no supporting documentary evidence, whistleblower testimony, or missing persons pattern that investigative journalists or skeptical researchers have ever been able to verify. What makes this theory durable, rather than simply dismissed outright, is the genuine historical existence of Project Stargate itself, which establishes that a real government agency took the underlying premise, that some psychic phenomena might be real and worth weaponizing, seriously enough to fund for over 2 decades. That documented baseline of institutional seriousness toward the paranormal makes the much larger, scarier, unsubstantiated claim about secret childhood recruitment feel more plausible to people than it would if Project Stargate had never existed at all. Story 16. Humans are the pinnacle of intelligent life. This entry is interesting precisely because it's framed as a conspiracy theory, while actually functioning as a critique of one. The implicit suggestion is that the widely accepted, almost unquestioned assumption of human cognitive supremacy is itself a kind of unexamined ideological conspiracy. A comfortable story our species tells itself that doesn't survive close scrutiny. The case against human cognitive supremacy as an unqualified universal truth has genuine scientific backing, once you look closely at specific cognitive domains, rather than treating intelligence as one single undifferentiated trait. Octopuses demonstrate problem-solving and tool-use capabilities remarkable for a creature with a radically different neural architecture from vertebrates, including a nervous system substantially distributed throughout their arms rather than centralized. Crows and other corvids pass cognitive tests involving planning, tool manufacture, and even apparent theory of mind that rival results from primates. Elephants display grief behavior, mirror self-recognition, and long-term social memory spanning years. Dolphins use complex individualized vocal signatures functioning similarly to names. The more philosophically interesting version of this challenge isn't about specific animal cognition comparisons, but about the very framework of ranking intelligence on a single linear scale with humans automatically at the top, which many researchers in animal cognition now consider a flawed anthropocentric methodology. Measuring other species by how closely their cognition resembles specifically human cognitive strengths, like abstract language and tool use, rather than evaluating intelligence relative to what each species actually needs to thrive in its own ecological niche, which is a fundamentally different and arguably more honest standard. This isn't really a conspiracy theory at all in the traditional sense. There's no hidden cabal suppressing the truth about animal intelligence. It's a genuine, ongoing scientific and philosophical debate about whether the conventional human supremacist framework for understanding intelligence has ever actually been justified, dressed up here in conspiracy theory language for dramatic effect. Story 17. The moon is not natural. It's an alien-built construct. The artificial moon theory has attracted serious attention from a surprising range of sources over the decades, including some Soviet scientists in a published 1970 paper that proposed the moon might be a hollowed-out, artificially constructed spacecraft, based partly on the genuinely unusual orbital and physical characteristics the moon displays compared to the moons of other planets in our solar system. The specific anomalies cited are real and worth taking seriously as genuine scientific puzzles, even though they don't actually require an artificial explanation. The moon is unusually large relative to its host planet compared to virtually every other moon-planet pairing in the solar system, producing the remarkable and genuinely improbable-seeming coincidence that the moon's apparent size in our sky almost exactly matches the sun's apparent size, enabling the precise total solar eclipses we experience. The moon's near-perfectly circular orbit, and the fact that it presents exactly the same face toward Earth at all times due to tidal locking, are both specific characteristics that have prompted genuine scientific curiosity about the moon's formation history. The mainstream scientific explanation, the giant impact hypothesis, proposes that a Mars-sized protoplanet collided with the early Earth roughly 4.5 billion years ago, with the resulting debris coalescing into the moon, a theory supported by detailed analysis of lunar rock samples returned by Apollo missions, which show isotopic compositions remarkably similar to Earth's mantle, exactly what the impact hypothesis predicts. The eclipse coincidence, while genuinely striking, is also explained as exactly that, a temporary coincidence in cosmic terms, since the moon is very gradually moving away from Earth over geological time, meaning the perfect eclipse alignment we experience now wasn't always true in the deep past, and won't remain true in the deep future. The Soviet scientists' paper was a genuine serious scientific exercise in considering alternative hypotheses, not evidence the moon is actually artificial, but serious scientists once considered this, is exactly the kind of provenance that keeps a theory alive long after better evidence accumulates. Story 18. Monarchies never actually gave up power and secretly control 40% of the world. This theory proposes that the historical transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional, largely ceremonial royal institutions across most of Europe and elsewhere was substantially performative. That royal families retained genuine coordinated control over enormous wealth, land, and political influence behind the visible scenes of democratic governance, working through interlocking financial structures, intermarriage networks, and quiet influence over central banking and major financial institutions that never appears in any public account of how power actually functions today. The genuine documented kernel here involves real, substantial royal wealth and landholding that does receive far less public scrutiny than most other concentrations of comparable wealth. The British Crown Estate, while not personally owned by the monarch in the way most people assume, controls billions of pounds in property and assets, generating revenue that flows partly back to the monarchy through a formal funding mechanism. Various European royal families and non-European monarchies, including several Gulf states, control assets, land, and investment portfolios whose full scope is genuinely not transparent to public scrutiny in the way that, say, publicly traded corporations are required to disclose. The specific 40% of the planet figure that versions of this theory cite doesn't correspond to any documented, verifiable accounting that serious economists or historians have produced. It appears to be an extrapolated, dramatically rounded estimate rather than a sourced calculation, and the claim of coordinated, unified royal control across entirely separate national monarchies with documented historical rivalries, intermarriage notwithstanding, doesn't match the historical record of monarchies frequently working against each other's interests, rather than in coordinated alliance. What's real? Genuine wealth concentration with genuinely limited public transparency. What's speculative? That it's coordinated, unified, and secretly running the world behind the visible curtain of democratic institutions. Story 19. Project Seraphim. when the conspiracy theory is the art project. This entry is a refreshing change of pace from most of the list because it's explicitly, openly fictional from the outset. A short cinematic video built around an invented CIA program called Project Seraphim, created by someone with a genuine, long-standing interest in real black project history, signal intelligence theories, and the broader aesthetic and narrative texture of declassified government file culture. What makes this worth including isn't a claim that Project Seraphim is real. It explicitly isn't. But what it reveals about how convincingly the conspiracy theory format can be constructed once you understand its actual narrative conventions. Real black projects, once eventually declassified, tend to share specific structural and stylistic features. Evocative but bureaucratically bland code names, partial documentation with redacted or simply missing sections, organizational charts with unexplained gaps, and survivor or insider testimony that's compelling specifically because of its incompleteness rather than its detail. Real programs like Project MK-Ultra, Project Stargate, and the U-2 and SR-71 reconnaissance programs that fueled decades of UFO sightings before their eventual declassification all share this same texture. Someone with a genuine appreciation for that texture, building a fictional program using the same narrative grammar, produces something that can feel uncannily real to viewers without any actual deception necessarily intended. It's closer to a well-researched piece of speculative fiction or alternate history than a hoax, in the same creative tradition as found footage horror films or fake documentary formats that use realism as an artistic tool rather than a deceptive one. This entry is a useful reminder for the rest of this list. The difference between a genuinely convincing real-world conspiracy theory and a well-crafted piece of fiction, using the same structural conventions, can be remarkably thin, which says less about the supernatural or the hidden truth of the world, and more about which narrative formats reliably produce a feeling of unsettling plausibility in an audience. Story 20. Your dog is barking at a ghost you can't see. This theory builds its case on a genuinely common pet owner observation. Dogs barking, growling, or staring intently at apparently empty space, with no obvious environmental trigger like a sound, smell, or visual stimulus a human in the room can identify, and extends it into the proposal that dogs can perceive ghosts or spirits that exist in a sensory range human eyes simply cannot access, with canine vision specifically cited as the relevant superior sense responsible. Dogs do genuinely have meaningfully different sensory capabilities from humans, which gives this theory a real foundation to build from even though the specific conclusion isn't well supported. Dog hearing extends to frequencies well beyond human hearing range, allowing them to detect sounds entirely inaudible to us, including high-frequency electrical hums, distant sounds, or small animals moving in walls or under floors that produce no perceptible noise to human ears. Dog smell is also dramatically more sensitive than human smell, by orders of magnitude, allowing dogs to detect scent trails, other animals, or environmental changes entirely undetectable to their owners. Dog vision, however, is actually generally considered somewhat inferior to human vision in several respects relevant to this specific theory. Dogs see a more limited color range than humans, lacking full trichromatic color vision, and have lower visual acuity for fine detail at distance, though they do have better motion detection and superior night vision sensitivity in low light due to a higher proportion of rod cells in their retinas. This actually undercuts the advanced vision framing of the theory directly, even though it doesn't undercut the dogs detect something real premise. The more parsimonious explanation for dogs apparently reacting to nothing is almost certainly their vastly superior hearing and smell detecting entirely real mundane environmental stimuli. Distant sounds, settling structures, small pests, or scent trails that their owners simply cannot perceive, rather than anything supernatural requiring a ghost explanation at all. Story 21. Werewolves, vampires, and dragons show up everywhere because something real was being described. This theory runs on the same cross-cultural mythology logic covered elsewhere on this list but deserves its own treatment because it makes a sharper, more specific version of the argument that the remarkable consistency of certain supernatural creature archetypes across entirely disconnected ancient cultures, peoples with no documented trade routes, no shared language, sometimes not even confirmed awareness of each other's existence, is too improbable to attribute to coincidental independent invention, and therefore must reflect descriptions of something genuinely encountered and then mythologized differently across cultures. The comparative mythology counterargument, developed extensively by researchers including Joseph Campbell and many subsequent folklorists, proposes that humans share deep, evolutionarily embedded psychological structures, universal fears of predation, darkness, disease, and death, universal hopes around protection, transformation, and power that would predictably generate broadly similar monster and hero archetypes across unconnected cultures without requiring any of the monsters themselves to be literally real. a blood-drinking, shape-shifting predator that hunts at night, preys on genuinely universal human fears about disease transmission, nocturnal vulnerability, and the loss of bodily control, which would explain vampire-adjacent mythology emerging independently in multiple cultures, without needing an actual vampire anywhere in the historical record. Disease explanations have also been proposed for specific creature categories. Rabies symptoms including aggression, hypersensitivity to light, and excessive salivation have been linked by some historians to werewolf mythology, while porphyria, a genuine if rare blood disorder causing severe light sensitivity and other symptoms, has been speculatively connected to some vampire folklore, though both of these specific disease connections remain contested rather than definitively established by medical historians. What's genuinely true is that cross-cultural consistency is real and worth taking seriously as a phenomenon requiring explanation. Whether that explanation requires literal monsters or simply universal human psychology responding to universal human fears remains the actual open question, not settled by either side's confident framing. Story 22. Someone reached the Americas before the Vikings, and the evidence keeps accumulating. This theory has moved meaningfully from speculative fringe territory toward genuine, increasingly mainstream archaeological respectability over recent decades, which makes it one of the stronger entries on this entire list in terms of actual supporting evidence. The official history most people learned places Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage as the first sustained European contact with the Americas, with the Vikings' brief ultimately abandoned settlement at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, dated to around 1000 CE and confirmed archaeologically in the 1960s, representing the first confirmed pre-Columbian contact widely accepted by mainstream historians. The theory in question proposes contact occurred even earlier than the Vikings, potentially by entirely different cultures. The evidence supporting earlier contact has been accumulating steadily. Genetic studies of certain indigenous South American populations have identified DNA markers with apparent connections to Pacific Islander populations, suggesting possible pre-Columbian Polynesian contact with South America, a theory that gained additional support when sweet potatoes, a crop with South American origins, were found to have been present and cultivated in Polynesia well before confirmed European contact in the region, requiring some plausible transoceanic transfer mechanism. The Solutrean hypothesis, while contested and not broadly accepted among mainstream archaeologists, proposes possible contact between Ice Age European populations and early Americans based on certain stone tool technology similarities, though this remains a genuine minority position within archaeology rather than consensus. What's driving increasing openness to something happened before the Vikings among mainstream archaeologists isn't any single smoking gun discovery but an accumulating body of genetic, linguistic, and botanical evidence that's individually inconclusive, but collectively harder to dismiss than it would have been treated a generation ago. This is one of the rare entries on this list where being patient and watching the ongoing research seems like the genuinely correct response, rather than either confident belief or confident dismissal. Story 23. Every flood myth traces back to one real ancient catastrophic event. The Near Eastern flood myths, with Noah's flood from Genesis being the most culturally familiar version to a Western audience, propose that a folk memory of a genuine catastrophic regional flooding event persisted across generations through oral tradition long before any of these stories were written down, eventually surfacing in remarkably similar form across multiple ancient Near Eastern cultures with documented contact and shared cultural influence, including the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh's flood narrative, which predates the biblical account in its written form, and shares striking structural and narrative similarities. This theory occupies an interesting middle position on the spectrum of plausibility compared to most entries on this list, because unlike the global flood myth theory covered elsewhere here, which proposes a single planet-spanning catastrophic flood explaining flood myths from entirely disconnected cultures worldwide, this version is geographically and culturally constrained in a way that makes it considerably more scientifically tractable. The ancient Near East, where these specific flood narratives cluster, sits at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a region with well-documented historical vulnerability to catastrophic flooding events throughout its settled history, including archaeological evidence of significant flood deposits at sites including Shuruppak, dated to around 2900 BCE, roughly matching the era when versions of these flood narratives are believed to have originated. This doesn't require any single, uniquely massive global cataclysm. A genuinely severe regional flood, devastating enough to functionally end civilizations and societies as the people living through it understood them, could plausibly generate a flood narrative of mythic, world-ending proportions in the oral tradition of survivors, especially once retold and embellished across many subsequent generations before eventually being written down. This is one of the more evidence-supported entries on the entire list, with real archaeological flood deposits, documented shared cultural influence between the relevant ancient civilizations, and textual scholarship establishing clear narrative lineage between the Mesopotamian and biblical versions specifically. Story 24. Agriculture started long before the last ice age ended, and we're about to find the proof frozen somewhere. This theory makes a specific, falsifiable prediction rather than a vague historical claim, which is genuinely rare and worth appreciating on a list like this one. That agriculture and deliberate plant cultivation were already underway among certain human populations before the last glacial period ended roughly 12,000 years ago, considerably earlier than the conventional archaeological timeline, which places the origins of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent at approximately that same 12,000-year mark, not meaningfully before it. The theory specifically predicts that physical evidence, preserved seed caches, agricultural tools, or even a frozen body carrying stored grain, will eventually be recovered from permafrost as climate change accelerates thaw and exposes previously inaccessible ancient material. There is genuine, if still preliminary, archaeological evidence pointing toward earlier than expected plant management and cultivation-adjacent behavior. Excavations at Ohalo II in Israel, dated to roughly 23,000 years ago, recovered evidence of wild grain harvesting and processing on a scale that some researchers argue represents proto-agricultural behavior considerably predating the conventional Fertile Crescent agricultural revolution timeline. Similar findings of intensive wild plant management, though stopping short of full domestication, have emerged from various other Paleolithic sites, suggesting the transition to agriculture may have been a longer, more gradual continuum than the relatively sudden agricultural revolution framing implies. The frozen evidence prediction specifically is genuinely plausible as an ongoing research possibility. Permafrost has already yielded extraordinary preserved organic material in unrelated contexts, including frozen mammoth remains with stomach contents intact, and accelerating permafrost thaw due to climate change is somewhat ironically actively exposing increasing amounts of previously inaccessible ancient material across Siberia and other permafrost regions, with archaeologists racing against the same warming trend to recover and study material before it degrades upon exposure. This is a genuinely well-reasoned, evidence-supported speculation rather than a fringe claim, predicting a specific kind of future discovery based on a real, ongoing pattern of earlier-than-expected agricultural evidence and a real, accelerating environmental process that could plausibly deliver exactly the kind of confirmation being predicted. Story 25. St. Patrick was quietly pushed out and reassigned to Glastonbury Abbey. This theory builds on a real, surviving primary source and a real, documented tomb tradition, which gives it more historical grounding than most entries on this list. St. Patrick's own Confessio, one of the very few surviving autobiographical texts from his era, and one of the most important primary sources we have for 5th century British and Irish Christianity, is, on close reading, substantially a defensive document, written by Patrick specifically to justify his missionary conduct and authority against criticism and challenges from within the church hierarchy back in Britain. The theory proposes that this documented internal church conflict wasn't simply a war of words that Patrick successfully weathered, as the traditional hagiographic account suggests, but that his critics actually succeeded, at least partially, in having him removed from his missionary post in Ireland, with Glastonbury Abbey in the West Country of England, which does maintain a tomb tradition claiming to hold Patrick's remains, a claim most professional historians treat with significant skepticism rather than acceptance, serving as his subsequent lower-profile reassignment. The geographic logic offered in support is genuinely reasonable on its own terms. Patrick's exact birthplace remains disputed among historians, but several candidate locations place him plausibly in or near the West Country region of Britain, which would make a return assignment to Glastonbury specifically a coherent, contextually sensible outcome rather than a randomly chosen location for a fabricated relic tradition to attach itself to later. Mainstream Patrick scholarship generally maintains that he continued his Irish mission until his death, with the Glastonbury tomb tradition treated as one of many later medieval relic claims that emerged across multiple abbeys competing for prestige and pilgrimage revenue during the medieval period, a well-documented phenomenon affecting the relics of numerous early saints, not unique to Patrick specifically. The Confessio's genuinely defensive tone is real and worth taking seriously as evidence of real conflict. Whether that conflict ended in expulsion rather than vindication remains the open, unresolved question. Story 26. Ancient peoples were genuinely smarter than we give them credit for, just differently. This is less a single specific conspiracy claim and more a broad corrective thesis, and it's one that mainstream archaeology and anthropology have actually been increasingly embracing rather than resisting, which makes it one of the more credible entries on this entire list, even framed as a theory. The popular cultural assumption that ancient peoples were simple, unsophisticated, and intellectually inferior to modern humans, sometimes deployed explicitly or implicitly to justify the ancient astronaut theories covered elsewhere on this list, since ancient humans couldn't possibly have figured this out themselves, is the load-bearing assumption underneath most of those theories, doesn't survive close examination of the actual archaeological and ethnographic record. Polynesian wayfinding navigation across the vast Pacific Ocean, conducted without any instruments, using detailed knowledge of star positions, wave patterns, cloud formations, and bird behavior passed down through rigorous oral and practical training traditions, represents a level of sophisticated environmental and astronomical knowledge that took Western navigational science centuries of instrument development to functionally replicate. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have been documented preserving genuinely accurate astronomical and even geological information across spans of tens of thousands of years, including descriptions matching coastlines that have since been confirmed by modern sea level reconstruction to have existed in exactly the form described, before rising sea levels submerged them. Inca Quipu, knotted cord systems used for record keeping and potentially even narrative encoding, represent a sophisticated information storage technology that doesn't require written script in the way Western frameworks typically demand to recognize literacy. What this corrective thesis argues, fundamentally, is that intelligence measured narrowly through the specific lens of modern technological and written achievement systematically undervalues other equally sophisticated cognitive traditions, oral memory systems, environmental pattern recognition, and practical engineering knowledge transmitted without formal writing, that don't fit the assumptions built into how we've historically measured ancient capability. Story 27. Most folklore origin stories are real events wrapped in fabrication, not pure invention. This theory pushes back against what its proponent describes as the dominant historian's assumption, that most traditional origin stories and folklore involving named historical or quasi-historical figures are essentially creative inventions designed to provide cultural meaning and entertainment for societies without other forms of recorded history, rather than retaining any substantial connection to actual events. The counterposition proposed here is more specific and more defensible than a blanket, all myths are literally true claim. That the underlying structure of many origin stories, specific genealogies, specific conflicts, specific migrations or founding events, likely preserves real historical information that became embellished, exaggerated, or symbolically reframed over generations of retelling, rather than representing pure fictional invention from the outset. This position has genuine, substantial support in the academic discipline of oral history and historical linguistics. The Iliad and Odyssey, long treated by some scholars as pure literary invention with no historical basis, gained dramatically increased credibility as potentially reflecting real Bronze Age events once Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Hissarlik in the 1870s confirmed that a real city matching key details of Homeric Troy had genuinely existed and been destroyed, in a manner consistent with warfare, during roughly the right historical period. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, again, have demonstrated remarkable, independently verified accuracy regarding specific geographic and astronomical details across time spans that should, by conventional assumptions about oral traditions' reliability, have degraded into unrecognizable fiction long before now. The mainstream historians caution that this theory is pushing against isn't baseless either. Confirmed historical legends are vastly outnumbered by myths and folklore for which no corroborating archaeological or independent evidence has ever been found. And the burden of proof for treating any specific story as real events with fabrication rather than pure invention has to be established case by case, evidence by evidence, rather than assumed wholesale across the entire category. Story 28. Western civilization's real distinction isn't that it had slavery, it's that it ended. This is presented as a conspiracy theory but functions more as a deliberately contrarian historical and moral argument, designed to challenge what its proponent sees as an oversimplified, purely negative dominant narrative about Western civilization's historical legacy, particularly regarding colonialism and slavery. The argument's specific factual claim that virtually every sufficiently large, complex civilization throughout recorded history practiced some form of slavery or forced unfree labor, including Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Aztec, various African kingdoms, numerous Asian dynasties, and Islamic caliphates among many others, is broadly supported by the historical record and isn't seriously disputed by historians. Slavery in various forms was, unfortunately, close to a near-universal feature of pre-modern complex societies across virtually every continent and culture, not a uniquely Western invention or practice. The more contested claim is the comparative one, that the specifically Western, and more specifically British-led, abolitionist movement of the late 18th and 19th centuries, culminating in Britain's 1833 Slavery Abolition Act and the Royal Navy's subsequent decades-long costly campaign to suppress the transatlantic slave trade internationally, represents something historically distinctive worth highlighting, rather than simply another phase of the same exploitative system. Historians broadly agree the abolitionist movement was real, influential, and eventually globally consequential. Where genuine, serious historical debate continues is over how to weigh that abolitionist legacy against the simultaneous, undeniable fact that many of the same Western nations actively profited from, expanded, and defended both slavery and colonial exploitation for centuries before, and even during the same period abolition was gaining political traction. This is less a hidden truth being suppressed, and more a genuinely contested matter of historical emphasis and moral weighting, where reasonable historians land in meaningfully different places depending on which specific aspects of an enormously complex history they choose to foreground. Story 29. Every religion's flood story comes from one original source. Religion. This is a more maximalist version of the regional Near Eastern flood theory covered earlier, extending the claim to genuinely global scope, that flood narratives appearing not just across the ancient Near East but across entirely disconnected world cultures, Mesoamerican, Chinese, Indian, Native American, and many others. All trace back to one single original source religion and one single original historical flood event, with the various culturally specific versions representing divergent retellings of fundamentally the same underlying story, with names and locations changed but the core narrative sequence preserved. The genuine cross-cultural prevalence of flood myths is real and well documented by comparative mythologists. Flood narratives genuinely do appear with striking frequency across an enormous range of disconnected cultures worldwide. But the explanation favored by most mythology researchers and historians is considerably less unified than one shared original religion. Floods are simply among the most common, most universally destructive, and most narratively dramatic natural disasters that human settlements throughout history have actually experienced repeatedly and independently, particularly for the large proportion of early civilizations that specifically settled near rivers and coastlines precisely because of the agricultural and trade benefits those locations offered, while also inheriting the corresponding flood risk that comes with that same geography. A genuinely catastrophic, civilization-threatening flood is exactly the kind of event that would independently generate mythologized, larger-than-life flood narratives in entirely disconnected cultures without requiring any single shared point of origin, in the same way that earthquake myths, volcanic eruption myths, and drought myths all appear independently and repeatedly across disconnected cultures that experience those specific disasters, without anyone proposing those similarities require one single shared original source religion either. The exactly the same sequence of events claim is also considerably overstated once you examine the actual narrative details across different cultures' flood myths closely. The specific causes, divine motivations, survivor counts, and resolution details vary substantially between traditions, sharing the broad flood and survival structure without matching nearly as precisely as the unified origin theory claims. Story 30. Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. Edward de Vere did the Oxfordian theory of Shakespeare. Authorship proposes that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was the actual author behind the plays and poems traditionally attributed to William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, with Shakespeare himself serving as a front or pseudonym for de Vere, whose aristocratic status supposedly made direct public authorship of popular commercial theater socially inappropriate or professionally risky. This theory has attracted genuinely notable supporters over the decades, including some Supreme Court justices and prominent actors, which gives it a degree of high-profile cultural visibility that most authorship alternative theories don't achieve. The arguments typically offered include de Vere's documented education, extensive European travel matching settings described in several plays, and various claimed biographical parallels between events in de Vere's life and plot elements or character details across the Shakespearean canon. The overwhelming consensus among professional historians, literary scholars, and Shakespeare specialists firmly rejects the Oxfordian theory, for reasons considered close to definitive within the field. Edward de Vere died in 1604, while a substantial number of plays widely accepted as Shakespeare's, including The Tempest, are dated by textual and historical evidence to after that year, which would require de Vere to have written and somehow arranged the posthumous staggered release of these later works, an additional and unsupported complication the theory has never adequately resolved. Extensive documentary evidence from Shakespeare's own lifetime, including contemporary references by other playwrights and theater figures, royal records, and his own personal and business dealings recorded in legal documents, consistently treats Shakespeare of Stratford as the genuine, active author and theater professional that the traditional account describes, not as a front for someone else. The theory's continued public interest, despite this overwhelming and largely settled scholarly rejection, says something genuinely interesting about how culturally appealing the famous genius wasn't who you think. Narratives remain, regardless of the actual weight of evidence against them. Story 31. The Great Pyramid proves ancient people were better at some things than we are today. This theory occupies an interesting and genuinely defensible middle ground between dismissing ancient achievement entirely and reaching for alien explanations. It proposes more modestly and considerably more credibly that ancient builders possessed specific practical engineering and organizational capabilities in certain narrow domains that modern society, despite its overall technological advancement, would genuinely struggle to replicate using comparable methods and resources today. The Great Pyramid of Giza, completed roughly 4,500 years ago, achieves a level of precision that remains genuinely remarkable by any standard. Its base is nearly perfectly level and square, with corner angles deviating from a true 90 degrees by mere fractions of a degree across a structure spanning over 230 meters per side, and its sides are oriented to true north with an accuracy of better than 1/15 of 1 degree. Precision achieved using only naked eye astronomical observation, careful surveying, and an enormous, well-organized, sustained labor force, with no electronic instruments of any kind. This isn't a claim that requires aliens or lost advanced civilizations to explain. The achievement is fully consistent with what we know about ancient Egyptian mathematics, astronomy, and large-scale labor organization from surviving papyri, worker housing excavations, and documented quarrying and transport techniques. The actual point being made is narrower and more defensible, that modern society, despite vastly superior technology in nearly every domain, has in some sense lost certain specific practical skills and the particular kind of patient large-scale collective organizational capability that made monuments like the Great Pyramid achievable, precisely because modern construction relies on entirely different methods and almost never requires that specific combination of unaided precision and multi-decade sustained labor coordination at that scale. This is less a hidden conspiracy and more a genuinely interesting, evidence-supported observation about how technological progress in one domain doesn't guarantee preserved capability in every domain that came before it. Story 32. UFOs and ancient religious visions are actually the same phenomenon. This theory proposes that the modern UFO phenomenon and the divine, angelic, or supernatural visions described throughout the religious texts and mythological traditions of ancient civilizations are not separate categories of human experience, but represent the same underlying phenomenon, simply interpreted and described using whatever cultural and conceptual framework happened to be available to the observer at the time. Divine chariots and angels for ancient witnesses operating within a religious worldview, extraterrestrial spacecraft and beings from modern witnesses operating within a religious worldview, extraterrestrial spacecraft and beings from modern witnesses operating within a scientific and technological worldview. This idea has genuinely serious intellectual proponents, rather than existing only in fringe internet spaces. French researcher Jacques Vallée, a credentialed and widely respected figure in UFO research with academic training in mathematics and computer science, has argued extensively across multiple published books that the behavioral patterns described in UFO encounter reports, including paralysis, altered states of consciousness, communication of seemingly profound but often vague or contradictory messages, and missing time, bear a striking structural resemblance to encounter narratives found in folklore, fairy abduction stories, and religious visionary experiences across numerous historical periods and cultures, predating any possible influence from modern science fiction. The argument isn't necessarily that ancient religious witnesses were seeing literal extraterrestrial spacecraft misinterpreted through a religious lens, but something more genuinely unsettling and harder to dismiss, that human consciousness may have a persistent, recurring capacity or vulnerability to a specific category of non-ordinary experience across all of recorded history, one that gets culturally reinterpreted generation after generation according to whatever explanatory framework, religious, folkloric, or technological, happens to be culturally available and credible at the time, without the underlying experiential phenomenon itself necessarily changing at all. Whether that recurring experiential category reflects something genuinely external to human minds, or a consistent feature of human neurology and altered states of consciousness expressing itself differently across changing cultural contexts, is the actual open question this version of the theory raises, and it's a considerably more sophisticated question than either pure UFO belief or pure religious literalism on their own. Story 33. Nuclear weapons tests, not hairspray, actually caused the ozone hole. The mainstream extensively peer-reviewed scientific explanation for the Antarctic ozone hole, first identified and confirmed in the mid-1980s, attributes it overwhelmingly to chlorofluorocarbons, commonly known as CFCs, chemical compounds that were widely used in aerosol sprays including hairspray, as well as refrigerants in various industrial applications throughout the mid-20th century. CFCs released into the atmosphere were shown through extensive atmospheric chemistry research to migrate to the stratosphere, where ultraviolet radiation breaks them apart and releases chlorine atoms that catalytically destroy ozone molecules in a self-sustaining chain reaction. This scientific consensus directly led to the 1987 Montreal Protocol, a landmark international agreement to phase out CFC production, widely regarded as one of the most successful environmental treaties in history given the demonstrated subsequent partial recovery of stratospheric ozone levels. The theory proposing nuclear weapons testing as the actual cause instead doesn't have comparable scientific support, though there is a genuine, real, but considerably more limited scientific connection, worth acknowledging rather than dismissing entirely. Large-scale atmospheric nuclear detonations do produce measurable nitrogen oxide compounds, and nitrogen oxides are indeed known to also contribute to stratospheric ozone depletion through a separate, well-understood chemical pathway, distinct from the CFC mechanism. However, the overwhelming majority of large-scale atmospheric nuclear testing by major powers concluded by the early 1960s under the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, well over 2 decades before the ozone hole was first scientifically identified and measured in the mid-1980s, and the specific, detailed atmospheric chemistry measurements taken during the ozone hole's actual discovery and characterization matched the CFC chlorine-catalyzed destruction mechanism specifically, not a nitrogen oxide signature consistent with nuclear testing residue from decades earlier. The hairspray explanation, often mocked retrospectively as if it were an oversimplified, faintly ridiculous popular caricature of real atmospheric science, was and remains essentially scientifically accurate. CFC aerosol propellants genuinely were a major contributing source, and the eventual global regulatory response genuinely worked. Story 34. Most ancient people actually thought the Earth was flat, and that's not the conspiracy you think it is. This theory pushes back specifically against a popular, somewhat smug modern counter-narrative, the increasingly common claim, often deployed to sound clever and well-informed, that educated ancient people always knew the Earth was round. The flat Earth thing is a myth about medieval ignorance, by proposing the more nuanced, historically grounded reality that while certain specific groups of educated ancient elites, particularly within Greek scientific and philosophical tradition from roughly the 6th century BCE onward, genuinely did establish and accept that the Earth was spherical through documented astronomical reasoning, this knowledge was concentrated among a relatively narrow scholarly class and was very plausibly not the dominant common understanding among the vast majority of ordinary people across most ancient societies and most of human history. The genuine historical record does support a real, well-documented scientific tradition of Earth sphericity knowledge among ancient Greek scholars. Specifically, Eratosthenes famously calculated Earth's circumference with startling accuracy around 240 BCE, using shadow measurements and known distances between 2 Egyptian cities. And this sphericity understanding was subsequently transmitted through later Greek, Roman, and medieval Islamic and European scholarly traditions without ever being fully lost among educated elites, contrary to the popular myth that medieval Europe broadly believed in a flat Earth. What the modern ancient people knew the Earth was round counter-narrative tends to overlook is that scholarly consensus among a relatively small, literate, specifically trained elite is meaningfully different from common, widespread popular understanding, and the cognitive intuition that down simply means toward an absolute universal bottom, making the proposition that people on the opposite side of a sphere wouldn't simply fall off genuinely counterintuitive without specific astronomical or physical training to understand otherwise, would have made flat Earth assumptions a genuinely reasonable, intuitive, unexamined default for most ordinary people throughout most of history, entirely independent of what the relevant era's most educated scholars had already worked out and written down in texts that ordinary, non-literate populations had no access to or reason to encounter. Story 35. The Byzantine Empire never actually fell, it's just waiting to come back as a socialist state. This entry is delivered with clear comedic self-awareness, and it deserves appreciation specifically as a joke built on real historical irony, rather than sincere belief, which makes it a genuinely fitting lighter note to close this particular list on. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that persisted for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, finally fell in 1453, when Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II breached the city's legendary walls after an extended siege, ending the longest continuously surviving Roman political institution in history, and marking, in many historians' framing, one of the most significant turning points separating the medieval from the early modern era. This is settled, well-documented history, with essentially no genuine scholarly dispute about its basic facts. The joke entirely depends on combining two things that have nothing to do with each other in any serious historical sense: the genuine historical fact of the Byzantine Empire's fall, and the modern political concept of a socialist state, which is a 19th and 20th century ideological framework that has no meaningful connection to Byzantine governance, which was an autocratic Christian monarchy organized around imperial and ecclesiastical authority structures entirely unlike modern socialism's theoretical foundations. There's also a layer of irony in imagining a deeply traditionalist, monarchist, religiously orthodox empire returning, specifically as a fully funded socialist state, which is close to historically and ideologically incoherent on purpose, in the same comedic spirit as imagining ancient Rome secretly planning a return as a tech startup. What makes an entry like this genuinely worth including on a list otherwise full of sincere belief is the reminder that the conspiracy theory format itself, hidden truths, secret continuities, dramatic future reveals, is flexible enough to become pure comedy once you stop trying to make the underlying claim plausible and just enjoy the structure for its own absurd sake.